This is the second of the PowerPoints about advertising in the 1920s. And this one, I'm going to zero in a little more closely on advertising and gender in the 20s and look at a handful of slides that illustrate some of the prominent themes. In the previous overview we did of print advertising, in the prior PowerPoint, I mentioned how women were being used in more active sorts of ways as in print advertising in the 20s, being depicted as active, thoughtful consumers and being depicted more as sexual beings rather than being simply objectified sexually, although that still went on too. And we're going to look in this PowerPoint at some other examples of how, in some ways, you see women, as I mentioned, being depicted in more sorts of modern ways in 20s advertising, but also still facing some of the same stereotypes. So here are a couple more examples of what I'm talking about, ways that illustrations in advertising targeted women. To the left, you see an illustration from Leslie's magazine, a popular magazine of the era. And this reflects the fact that beginning in 1920, women had the right to vote. Black women still largely discriminated against. Various obstacles to Black women voting aren't going to be rectified until all the way up in 1964 with the Voting Rights Act. And in this depiction, you have a woman entering the voting booth, looking directly at you, the viewer, their head raised in a very confident way as she heads to vote. This stylistic trend of having women looking directly at the viewer of the advertisement or the illustration is a change in the 1920s as well. A lot of photography done in the late 19th century and commercial illustration, and this is true into the early 20th century, the 19-teens, tended to depict women with what some art historians have called the averted gaze, where women had their eyes cast downward in kind of a more submissive posture. That began to change with depictions of women in illustrations and advertising in the 1920s, which frequently, as in these two examples, showed them directly looking at you, the viewer, in a very confident way. The cover of Vogue to the right of this slide, another example. This woman is very fashionably dressed, confidently looking at you, the reader, the viewer, and on top of that, this illustration has her firmly in control of the latest technology of the decade, the automobile. But despite these trends and advancements in depicting women in ways that you could say presented women in more liberated fashion, a lot of stereotypes and traditional gender depictions persisted in advertising, and we're going to look at a few examples of that. Here's one for Woodbury's facial soap, Skin You Love to Touch. This idea of women being presented in a way where kind of their primary objective in life seemed to be making themselves not just presentable, but attractive to the opposite sex is something that you see heavily emphasized in advertising in the 1920s. This is another example, deodorant, kind of a product that before the 1920s had been considered, I guess, somewhat taboo for advertising, became widely advertised during the decade. I don't have an illustration of one of my favorite advertisements for deodorant directed at women in the 20s talked about women making their armpits into charm pits, but here you have this woman taking the armhole odor test, and again, the emphasis is not so much on her worried about her body odor, and the whole idea of body odor and BO is a construct and an invention of the 1920s too that appeared in advertising. But again, with her saying, is this how I smell to others? Again, this emphasis on her attractiveness to the opposite sex. Preserving youth was another prominent theme in advertising directed at women. You don't see men subjected to this in advertising in the 1920s. But things like Palmolive soap to the left in this slide, emphasizing women maintaining a schoolgirl complexion. It's a bit disturbing. And Elizabeth Arden makeup literally saying farewell to age, with this somewhat frightening illustration on the right of a woman with the implication that somehow she's discovered the fountain of youth and will be eternally young. So overall, advertisers frequently emphasized physical appearance for a woman, and that was repeatedly in the text you see in advertisements, the illustrations. Physical beauty and attractiveness was valued over other qualities, particularly intellect. You see that in this Palmolive advertisement. Most men ask, is she pretty, not, is she clever? And this reflected a widespread theme, very prominent in advertisements directed at women in the 1920s. One thing about these ads you may have noticed with a lot of them, like this one, they're very wordy. This is an era when advertisers assumed readers were going to read all of this text, convincing them about why they should purchase Palmolive soap. We're conditioned much differently now. Advertising, print advertising, which most of you, I would guess, don't even see anymore, because how many of you actually pick up and look at a hard copy of a magazine? But even 20, 30 years ago, advertisers started moving away from this sort of thing, because now we just expect to see an illustration, a Nike shoe, and something like a slogan, just do it. And we don't need any further explanation about the product. Not true in the 1920s. There's still a tremendous amount of energy that companies and advertisers put into persuading people about why a product is worthwhile. But as we've seen, there's also this greater emphasis on catchy slogans. But this idea of women's physical appearance, physical beauty, physical attractiveness being valued above other qualities is something I want you to keep in mind as you evaluate the Listerine advertisement for this week.